boxers are trained to punch in clusters, the classic being the left-right or the 1-2. It wouldn't be going too far to think of Victorian Christianity as a tired old fighter sent sprawling by the old 1-2. The first blow came from the emerging science of the historical critical study of the Scriptures, which sent confidence in the Bible spinning. Then came the right cross from Charles Darwin and Sir Charles Lyell, who together flattened the Victorians' confidence in the story of creation. So far this week, we've been looking at the poetics of doubt. Now we look at what you might call the forensics, the accumulation of new discoveries about the world and new approaches to the Bible that challenge the traditional understanding of God in Victorian England. A.N. Wilson, author of The Victorians, describes how they felt increasingly battered by the impact of these new sciences.
Paley, Archdeacon Paley, had written this very useful book, Evidences, more or less proving argument by design that, you walk through a field and you pick up a watch. It's so intricately made, it must have had a maker. They were happy with that. Then along comes Charles Lyell, who in a way is the real person who starts to unlock the whole thing, who was a geologist. If you count the years in the Bible backwards, from where we are now, back through all the people who begat so-and-so and begat so-and-so, I think you'll get back to October 4004 BC, which is when the fall of man happened. And in many old Bibles, the dates were actually written. Well, obviously, once you get the fossils and the geology coming along, you realise that the universe is millions of years old and that it cannot possibly be true.
Lyell published his 3-volume Principles of Geology between 1830 and 1833. Then, in 1845, Charles Darwin published an article in the Journal of Natural History. It wasn't just the truth of the Bible that was being challenged. It was being suggested that we were just another species of animal, millions of which had already been wiped out by cruel nature. We were no longer immortal souls. Like all the other species on the planet, we were dying animals.
Charles Lyell. The inhabitants of the globe, like all other parts of it, are subject to change. It is not only the individual that perishes, but the whole species.
Charles Darwin. We are therefore driven to the conclusion that causes quite inappreciable by us determine whether a given species shall be abundant or scanty in numbers. Why then should we feel astonishment if the rarity is occasionally carried a step further to extinction?
Now there was even more to doubt, and as A.N. Wilson suggests, this catastrophic re-evaluation of our place in nature found expression in poets like Alfred Lord Tennyson.
In his long series of meditations, which he called In Memoriam, it was written out of a kind of nervous breakdown, grief for a dead friend. He meditates upon the whole intellectual revolution happening in his times. Why were they so disturbed? Partly because of the dating of the Bible thing, but much more, what did the fossils show? They showed that there had been whole species which had now been, as Tennyson says, cast as rubbish to the void. So that far from God loving nature so much that he notices the fall of a single sparrow, apparently there are dinosaurs and all sorts of creatures whom he didn't love at all and who've just become extinct. So it had a shattering effect.
Oh, yet we trust that somehow good will be the final goal of ill, to pangs of nature, sins of will, defects of doubt and taints of blood, that nothing walks with aimless feet, that not one life shall be destroyed or cast as rubbish to the void, when God hath made the pile complete.
The mid-19th century was a time of revolutionary change in almost every other department of life. There was economic and political change, rapid industrialization, and the inexorable growth of the British Empire. In a world of change and tumult, when nothing any longer seemed stable and everything was in flux, there was one thing the faithful could hold on to, quite literally, the Bible. So you can imagine their consternation when scholars began to challenge the truths enshrined in their most cherished book, and even began to question its authorship. Karen Armstrong, the historian of religions, describes how the new critical method of interpreting the Bible seemed to undermine almost everything Christians had been taught to believe.
What they call the higher criticism of the Bible, it begins in Germany at the time of the Enlightenment with scholars of the ancient world who start to treat the Bible like any other text and dissect it. And they find that, for example, that in the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Numbers, they find at least 4 different sources. That far from being created, just whispered into the ear of Moses, these were clearly compiled by editors who were taking at least 4 different sources from different periods of Hebrew history and putting them together to form a coherent narrative. And so that's why there are, for example, 2 versions of the creation story, one in Genesis 1 and one in Genesis 2. And, of course, this was very disturbing.
It was bad enough when the critics took aim at the Old Testament and undermined confidence in its authenticity. But when they turned to the New Testament and started to erode faith in Jesus as the Son of God and talked of him only as another healer and teacher, the Victorian nervous breakdown hit with a vengeance. A.N. Wilson.
When you take it forward in the Bible story to the figure of Jesus, who is supposedly the God-man, the incarnate, the very second person of the Trinity, walking about in Galilee, who is our Saviour, if you start applying, even to him, critical standards, looking at the Gospels, working out what sort of documents they really were, who might have written them, and placing them in their time, Sitz im Leben, as the Germans call it, where does that leave you? Well, it left David Friedrich Strauss, a great German scholar of Tübingen, with the belief that Jesus was just an ordinary man, a very remarkable man, but a prophet, not a God who had come to earth and become incarnate.
If you don't believe books can change history, then David Friedrich Strauss ought to change your mind. A lecturer at Tübingen University in Germany, in 1835 he wrote a famous book about Jesus, which claimed that the supernatural elements in the Gospel stories were not historical. They were examples of how myth emerges to enhance the significance and reputation of historic figures, but they should never be understood literally. Enter another writer, in the person of the novelist George Eliot. While her novels Middlemarch and Adam Bede are considerable achievements in themselves, there was more to her than great fiction. From her late 20s onwards, under her real name Marian Evans, she provided the first English translations of David Strauss's Life of Jesus, Ludwig Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity, and Baruch Spinoza's Ethics. It was while working on her first translation in Coventry that the doubts she'd had since she was 12 became irresistible.
One of the first things she started to do as a writer was to translate from the German. Not many people knew German, and she translated the Life of Jesus by Strauss. She had beside her it wasn't a crucifix exactly, it was a relief of the crucified, and as she wrote, the tears didn't just dribble, they gushed down. She wept and wept as she lost her faith. And she writes about it very, very marvellously, both in her letters, but also in, I think, particularly in Adam Bede, you get this sense of loss of faith.
The extent of her anguish is evident in a letter written from one friend, Mrs. Bray, to another, Sarah Hennell, on the 14th of February, 1846.
Miss Evans says she is Strauss sick. It makes her ill dissecting the beautiful story of the crucifixion, and only the sight of the ivory Christ image and picture make her endure it. Poor thing, I do pity her sometimes, with her pale, sickly face and dreadful headaches.
As an accommodation to her father, despite her doubts, she continued to go to church until his death in 1849. After that, her personal views became both public and more outspoken. As assistant editor and journalist at the radical Westminster Review, she wrote,
"Where is that Goshen of mediocrity in which a smattering of science and learning will pass for profound instruction, where platitudes will be accepted as wisdom, bigoted narrowness as holy zeal, and unctuous egoism as God-given piety. Let such a man become an evangelical preacher. He will then find it possible to reconcile small ability with great ambition, superficial knowledge with the prestige of erudition, and a middling moral with a high reputation for sanctity.
Eliot's other translation was Ludwig Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity, originally published in German in 1841, and it brings us to another key moment in our story. Feuerbach was a philosopher and anthropologist and a pupil of Hegel in Berlin. He was one of the first to suggest that God was a human construct, a projection or an invention of the human imagination.
Religion is the dream of the human mind. But even in dreams, we do not find ourselves in emptiness or in heaven, but on earth, in the realm of reality. For in these days, illusion only is sacred, truth profane. Religion has disappeared, and for it has been substituted the appearance of religion. Religion is human nature reflected, mirrored in itself. God is the mirror of man.
And with that, the final deconstruction of the personality of God, religion gets demythologized and reassembled as a picture of humanity itself. One of the 20th century's giants of New Testament scholarship was the Alsatian Albert Schweitzer. Born in 1875, Schweitzer dedicated his theological studies to what he called the quest for the historical Jesus. After years of research, he came to the conclusion that Jesus had been a prophet who believed the end of the world was nigh, and his role was to set up God's kingdom of justice and peace on earth. It didn't happen, and Jesus died a disappointed man who believed God had forsaken him. But this tragic conclusion did not end Schweitzer's commitment to Jesus. In 1913, he went with his wife to Lambaréné in what was then the French colony of Gabon to work as a doctor. He spent his life there no longer talking about Jesus, but still trying to follow him in the way of compassion. And therein may lie the best clue on how to deal with religious doubt.